Engines. They were all bigger than Edward and boasted about it. "The driver won't choose you again," said Gordon. "He wants strong engines like us." But the driver and fireman felt sorry for Edward. "Would you like to come out today?" "Oh, yes, please," said Edward. So they lit his fire, made lots of steam, and Edward puffed away. Edward worked hard all day. The coaches thought he was very kind, and the driver was very pleased. "I'm going out again tomorrow," Edward told the other engines that night. "What do you think of that?" For he was so tired and happy that he fell asleep at once. Next morning, Edward woke up to find nothing had changed. Gordon was still boasting. "Goodbye, little Edward. Look out for me this afternoon." Edward went off to do some shunting. He liked shunting. It was fun playing with freight cars. He would come up quietly and give them a push. Edward played till there were no more freight cars. Then he stopped to rest. Presently, he heard a whistle. Instead of nice shining coaches, he was pulling a dirty freight train. "A freight train, a freight train, a freight train," he grumbled. Edward laughed and went to find some more freight cars. Then there was trouble. "Gordon can't get up the hill," the porter called to Edward's driver. "Will you take Edward and push him, please?" They found Gordon halfway up and very cross. Edward's driver came up. "We've come to push." "No use at all," said Gordon. "You wait and see," replied Edward's driver. They brought the train back to the bottom of the hill. "I'm ready," said Edward. "No good," grumbled Gordon. They pulled and pushed as hard as they could. "I can't do it! I can't do it! I can't do it!" puffed Gordon. "I will do it! I will do it! I will do it!" puffed Edward. Edward pushed and puffed and puffed and pushed as hard as ever he could. "I've done it! I've done it! I've done it!" he said proudly. Edward was left out of breath and far behind, but he was happy because he had been so helpful. At the next station, he found that the driver and fireman were very pleased with him. The fireman gave him a nice long drink, and the driver said, "Then you'll be the smartest engine in the shed." As time went on, Edward and Gordon would often pass by. Edward would say, "Beep, beep, hello." Gordon always pulled the big express. He was proud of being the only engine strong enough to do so. Edward was the only engine left. "I'll come and try." "No use. Edward can't push the train." Kind Edward puffed and pushed and pushed and puffed, but he couldn't move the heavy coaches. "Beep, beep," said Edward. "I'm ready." "You've done it, hooray!" On their way home, Edward and Henry helped Gordon back to the shed. All three engines are now great friends. The other engines laughed. "Too impatient," they said. "You'd be sure to leave something behind." He felt just as bad next morning. Henry usually pulled the first train, and Thomas had to get his coaches ready. "If Henry is ill," he thought, "perhaps I shall pull his train." The other engines didn't take much notice, for But one night, Edward came to the shed. He was a kind little engine and felt sorry for Thomas. I've got some freight cars to take home tomorrow. If you take them instead of me, I'll push coaches in the yard. Thank you, said Thomas. That will be nice. Next morning, Edward and Thomas asked their drivers, and when they said yes, Thomas ran off happily to find freight cars. Hello, he always said to Thomas. But he still had a lot to learn. You can pull coaches or freight cars quite easily, but you must learn by your mistakes. Be careful with the coaches, James, said kind little Edward. They don't like being bumped. Everyone came to admire James. Go on, he puffed to Edward. Don't push, replied Edward. But no one seemed to know about Sir Topham's new hat, so James felt happier. Presently, they came to the station where Thomas was waiting with his two coaches. Hello, James, said Thomas. Feeling better? That's good. Edward and James passed the field where James had had his accident. The fence was mended and the cows were back again. They ended their journey and rested before setting off for home. But the conductor stopped the cars and got out to warn approaching engines. What silly things freight cars are. There might have been an accident. Should I help you, James? Called Edward. No, thank you. I'll pull them myself. Beep, beep, he whistled. Then James saw Sir Topham Hatt. Oh, dear, what will he say? He asked himself. You've made the most troublesome train on the line behave. Edward was shunting. Leave those freight cars, please, Edward, said Sir Topham Hatt. I want you to push coaches for me in the yard. Thank you, sir. That will be a nice change. That's a good engine. Off you go, then. So Edward found coaches for the three engines, and that day the trains ran as usual. But next morning, Edward looked unhappy. Gordon came clanking past, hissing rudely. They all hiss me, sir, answered Edward. They say tender engines don't shunt, and last night they said I have gray wheels. I haven't, have I, sir? But all the same, we do need another tank engine here. Edward, he called, here's Percy. Will you show him everything? Then Henry came by, hissing as usual. How beautifully you wheeshed him, laughed Edward. I can't wheesh like that. You have to wheesh loudly to make yourself heard. Next morning, Thomas arrived. Sir Topham Hatt sent for me. I expect he wants help, he said to Edward. Shh, shh, here he comes, replied Edward. Listen, Henry, Gordon, and James are sulking. They say they won't shunt like little tank engines. Little tank engines indeed, snorted Thomas. We'll show them. Edward and Thomas worked the main line, greeting each other as they passed by. They could go and play on the branch line for a few days. Edward and Percy played with the freight cars. Stop, 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 screamed the cars. Next, Edward took some empty cars to the quarry. Percy was left alone. He didn't have enough steam and came to a stop outside Edward's station. All he could do was to go slowly onto a siding, and Edward took charge of the train. What do you think is wrong, fireman? Asked Sir Topham Hatt. They have big fireboxes. Henry's is small and can't make the heat. With Welsh coal, he'd be a different engine. Yes, sir, said Henry, doubtfully. Later, Henry stopped at Edward's station. Hello, Henry, said Edward. You look splendid. I was pleased to hear your happy whistle yesterday. Shh, can you hear something? It sounds like Gordon, said Edward, and it ought to be Gordon. But Gordon never whistled like that. He didn't look at Henry, and he didn't look at Edward. He screamed straight through the station and disappeared. "Well," said Edward, and he told Edward what Gordon had said. So Edward had to push Gordon to the turntable to get him facing the right way. "Don't be silly, don't be silly," puffed Edward. At last, Gordon was on the turntable. When work was over, Thomas went to see the other engines. All their coats had been polished. "Huh," said Gordon. "Just look at us. Your driver will have to work fast to get you as smart as us." Everyone was getting very excited, and the drivers felt sure that Sir Topham Hatt would agree, as indeed he did. The engines were all busy making plans when silence fell. Suddenly, all the lights went on. What a marvelous sight awaited Mrs. Kindly. Percy was very pleased. "3 cheers for Mrs. Kindly," he called. "Beep, beep, beep." They all whistled. "We wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year." Thomas the Tank Engine and his friends thought it was the best Christmas ever, and Mrs. Kindly could think of nowhere she would rather live than here with them on the island of Sodor. He was taking empty cattle cars to a market town. The sun shone, birds sang. But Edward was heading for trouble. Come on," he puffed. "Oh, oh," screamed the cars. Edward puffed and clanked. The cars rattled and screamed. Some cows were grazing nearby. They were not used to trains. The noise and smoke disturbed them. As Edward clanked by, they broke through the fence and ran across the line. Edward felt a jerk, but didn't take much notice. He was used to cattle cars. "Bother those cars," he thought. "Why can't they come quietly?" He was at the next station before either he or his driver realized what had happened. Old Toby was cross. "You couldn't help it, Edward. They've never met cows. I have, and I know the trouble they are." Some days later, Gordon rushed through Edward's station. "Boop, boop. Mind the cows. Hurry, hurry," puffed Gordon. "Well, well, well," chuckled Edward. "Two big engines afraid of a cow. We didn't want the poor thing to hurt herself by running up against us. You see what I mean, my dear Edward?" "Yes, Gordon," said Edward. "Beep, beep. We're late. Where is Thomas? He doesn't usually make us wait." "Oh, dear, what can the matter be?" sang the fireman. "Johnny's so long, and..." "Never you mind about Johnny," laughed the driver. "Just you climb on the cab and look for Thomas." "Can you see him?" "There's Bertie Buss in a tearing hurry. No need to bother with him, though. Likely he's on a coach tour or something." He clambered down. "Stop! Stop! I've got Thomas's passengers!" wailed Bertie, roaring up to the gates. It was no good. Edward was gone. Why did I promise to help the passengers catch the train? Oh, no! Edward's at the station. No, he stopped at a crossing. Hooray! Hooray! Bertie tore down the hill. "Well done, Bertie," shouted his passengers. "Go it!" Bertie skidded into the yard. "Wait, wait!" cried Bertie. "This hill is too steep! This hill is too steep!" grumbled the coaches as Edward snorted in front. They reached the top at last and ran smoothly into the station. "Beep!" whistled Edward. "Get in quickly, please." He heard Bertie. Everything seemed to happen at once, and the station master told the conductor and driver what had happened. "I'm sorry about the chase, Bertie," said Edward. "Beep, beep. Goodbye, Bertie. We're off," whistled Edward. "3 cheers for Bertie," called the passenger. "I'm going to the scrapyard today," Edward called to Thomas. "What, already? You're not that old," Thomas was only teasing. "Oh," said Edward, "you're not broken and rusty. What are you doing here?" "I'm Trevor. They're going to break me up next week." "What a shame," said Edward. My driver Edward snorted. "People say I'm old-fashioned, but I don't care. Sir Topham Hatt says I'm a useful engine. What work did you do?" Set off for the station. "Broken up, what a shame. Broken up, what a shame. I must help Trevor, I must." He thought of all his friends who liked engines, but strangely, none of them would have room for a traction engine at home. "It's a shame, it's a shame," he hissed. Then, beep, beep. Why didn't I think the platform was the very person? Sir, he saws wood and gives children rides. We was in the vicarage orchard, and he sees Edward every day. This made him cross. "Late again!" Edward laughed, and James fumed away. The fireman was ready when Edward arrived. The inspector saw the pole and the rope. "Good man, jump in." We'll catch him, puffed Edward. We're coming, called Edward. Edward was panting up behind with every ounce of steam he had. At last, he caught up with James. "Steady, Edward," called his driver. The inspector stood on Edward's front, holding a noose of rope in the crook of the shunter's pole. He was trying to slip it over James's buffer. The fireman scrambled across and took control. "So, the old iron caught you after all," chuckled Edward. "I'm sorry," whispered James. "Thank you for saving me." "You were splendid, Edward." "That's all right," replied Edward. The engines arrived at the station side by side. Sir Topham Hatt was waiting. "I'm proud of you, Edward. You shall go to the works and have your worn parts mended." "Oh, thank you, sir," said Edward. It'll be lovely not to clank. He came to see him every day, but sometimes Trevor didn't have enough work to do. "Cheer up," smiled Edward. "Sir Topham Hatt has work for you at his new harbor. I'm to take you to meet Thomas today." Thomas was on his way to the harbor with a trainload of metal pilings. They were needed to make the harbor wall firm and safe. "A traction engine," explained Trevor. "I run on roads instead of rails." Thomas felt very miserable. "It's not fair," he complained. Edward smiled. "I know you aren't, and so does Sir Topham Hatt. You wait and see. Why don't you help me with these cars?" The cars were silly, heavy, and noisy. The two engines had to work hard, pushing and pulling all afternoon. The engines were finding life difficult. Workmen were mending the viaduct on the main line. The engines had to take great care when crossing the viaduct, and the delay often made them late on their journey to the junction, where they knew Thomas would be ready to collect his passengers. No one had been hurt, and soon Edward came to clear the mess. Sir Topham Hatt was on board. "Douglas was grand, sir," said Edward. "James had no steam left, but Douglas worked hard enough for 3. I heard him from my yard." "I want to be fair, Douglas, but I don't know." Percy decided to talk to Edward about it. "What you need," said Edward, "is a deputation." He explained what that was. Percy ran back quickly. Just then, Edward bustled up. "Bill and Ben, why are you playing here?" "There's no cause to be rude," said Edward severely. "This engine is a Metropolitan Vickers diesel-electric Type 2. I'm sorry I didn't understand about the cars." "That's all right then," said Edward. "Now off you go, Bill and Ben. Fetch Boco's cars, then you take this lot." "There's no real harm in them," he said to Boco, "but they're maddening at times." Boco chuckled. "But their track and bridges are not so strong as those on the main line. Sir Topham Hatt does not allow the heavier main line engines like Gordon to run on them." But one day, the way Gordon was talking, you would have thought Sir Topham Hatt had given this order for quite another reason. "What isn't fair?" asked Edward. "Never mind, Gordon. I'm sure Boco will let you pull his freight cars sometimes." "Why not? It would be a nice change." "Sir Topham Hatt would never approve," huffed Gordon. "Branch lines are vulgar." Gordon puffed away. Edward chuckled and followed him to the station. But tonight there was trouble. He thought the conductor had waved his flag. Gordon started, leaving luggage, his passengers, and the conductor all standing on the platform. To make matters worse, by the time Gordon had been stopped and brought back, Edward was already late with his train. So now he set off first. But the signalman at the junction wasn't told about the change. By mistake, he sent Edward along the main line. He found it hard to start the heavy train. "Did you see him straining?" asked Henry. "Positively painful," remarked James. "Just pathetic." "You're all jealous. Edward's better than any of you." "I've done it. We're off." "I've done it. We're off," said Edward as he finally puffed out of the station. Bill and Ben were delighted to see the visitors. They loved being photographed. Later, they took the party to the China Clay Works in a brake van special. Then Edward took the visitors home. On the way, the weather changed. Wind and rain buffeted Edward. His sanding gear failed, and his fireman rode in front, dropping sand on the rails by hand. Suddenly, Edward's wheels slipped fiercely, and with a shrieking crack, something broke. The crew inspected the damage. Repairs took some time. "One of your crank pins broke, Edward," said his driver. "We've taken your side rods off. Now you're like an old-fashioned engine. Can you get these people home? They must start back tonight." "I'll try, sir," promised Edward. Edward puffed and pulled his hardest, but his wheels kept slipping, and he could not start the heavy train. "We've loosened the couplings, Edward. Now you can pick up your coaches one by one, just as you do with freight cars." "That'll be much easier," said Edward. "Come on," he puffed and moved cautiously forward. "I've done it! I've done it!" puffed Edward. "Steady, boy," warned his driver. "Well done, boy. You've got them! You've got them!" and he listened happily to Edward's steady beat as he forged slowly but surely ahead. At last, battered, weary, but unbeaten, Edward steamed in. Henry was waiting for the visitors with the special train. Beep, beep! Cheered and thanked Edward, his driver and fireman. Duck and Boko saw to it that Edward was left in peace. Gordon and James remained respectfully silent. It would be nice to sing carols again, sighed Thomas as he set off on his important mission. Be quick now. At the big station, 1, 2, 3. Suddenly, like magic, the station was flooded with lights. Who have made this occasion possible. People say I'm old-fashioned, but I don't care. Sir Topham Hatt says I'm a useful engine.